Ever heard of a torture device so cruel? It was designed not to kill you fast, but to break your body inch by inch. A device so twisted the pain didn't just last for hours, it could stretch out for days. It was called the Judas Cradle, and if you've never heard of it before, brace yourself. Because what I'm about to describe might just ruin your day. Now imagine this. You're stripped naked in front of a crowd. Your wrists and ankles are tied with a rough rope, cutting into your skin. You're suspended above a tall, sharp wooden pyramid, not sharp enough to pierce you quickly. Oh no, that would be merciful. It's just sharp enough to slowly stretch, rip, and tear its way into your body. You're then lowered down, ever so gently, your full weight pressing down on a point that's invading you from below. Not through the stomach, not the chest, through your rectum, or for women, the vagina. And you don't drop all at once. They lower you down centimetre by centimetre, every movement calculated. So the pain isn't instant, it's gradual, intimate, personal. Muscles begin to tear, skin splits, and still they keep you balanced just enough to make sure you don't die too quickly. They want screams, they want spectacle. And the worst part, some people survived on that pyramid for days. Let that sink in. No sleep, no escape, just a wooden spike slowly entering your body while you rot. Alive. If torture devices that redefine horror fascinate you, hit subscribe, because this story gets unimaginably worse. You haven't even scratched the surface of what they did next. But that begs the question, what kind of twisted world created this nightmare in the first place? You might think the Judas Cradle was just the invention of a few sick minds. But no, this wasn't some isolated act of cruelty. It was a product of its time, a time drenched in fear, superstition, and a terrifying obsession with purity. Welcome to medieval Europe, where the church didn't just preach salvation, it controlled it. If you were accused of heresy, even whispering a thought that strayed from doctrine, you weren't just wrong, you were evil, you were dangerous, and that meant you had to be cleansed. And cleansing didn't mean forgiveness, it meant pain, brutal, public, righteous pain. During the Inquisition, fear wasn't just a byproduct of society, it was the fuel. Neighbours turned on each other, accusations flew like wildfire. Women who owned herbs, witches, men who questioned a priest, devil worshippers, and the church. It didn't just allow torture, it justified it. They believed the body could be punished to save the soul, as if tearing someone apart could somehow bring them closer to God. Pain became purification, suffering became salvation, and torture became holy. It was in this world, this swirling madness of fanaticism, fear, and blood-soaked faith, that a device like the Judas Cradle wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. And out of this obsession with sin came a device that punished it in the most divine way imaginable. It looks simple, almost harmless at a glance. A wooden frame, a few ropes, a single solid pyramid. But every inch of the Judas Cradle was crafted with one purpose: to inflict unimaginable pain for as long as possible. Let's break it down. At the centre was the main attraction, a tall conical wooden pyramid about 3 feet high. The point wasn't razor sharp. No, that would have made the pain too quick. Instead, it was slightly blunted, just enough to enter the body, but not enough to pierce cleanly. That dull pressure is what tore the victim slowly, fibre by fibre. To make it even more effective, they'd coat the tip in oil, not for mercy, but for control. Oil reduced friction just enough to keep the victim from slipping off entirely, allowing for precise, sustained agony. Above it, a large wooden frame, thick beams strong enough to suspend a fully grown adult. Attached to that, a system of ropes and pulleys. Now here's where it gets surgical. Victims were suspended in a leather harness, tied at the wrists and ankles. They were then lowered onto the pyramid, not dropped, not slammed, lowered, inch by inch, pulled by a crank controlled by the torturer's hand. And here's the most disturbing part. The pulleys were designed to pause mid-descent. They could stop the process for minutes or hours, keeping the victim balanced just above the point of collapse. Muscles trembling, skin stretching, internal pressure building, until the torturer decided to release another inch. This wasn't a tool of punishment, it was a scalpel of suffering. Every part of the design was intentional, measured, calculated. The leather harness didn't just hold you in place, it made sure you couldn't shift your weight to one side. You had to sit perfectly centered. That meant maximum pressure, maximum tearing, and absolutely no escape. From a distance, it looked like a crude chair, but up close, it was a masterpiece of pain engineering, and that's what made it so terrifying. The horror wasn't in how it looked, it was in how it worked. But the real horror wasn't the shape, it was the method. It began with humiliation. Prisoners were stripped naked, no cloth, no dignity. Men and women alike exposed to the cold air and to the eyes of their captors. Then came the binding, their wrists and ankles tied, not loosely, but tight enough to leave bruises, enough to cut circulation just slowly enough for them to feel it happen. Next, the approach. They were brought toward the pyramid, not told what it was, just shown. And as they were positioned above it, the truth hit. Too late to run, too late to scream. The body was suspended, hovering inches above the point, balanced by the harness with every muscle stretched tight. Breathing became shallow. The mind raced. Then came the descent. Slow, calculated, cruel. An inch, then a pause, another inch, another pause, the victim's weight pressing down on that wooden spike, forcing it into the most vulnerable parts of the human body. For men, through the rectum. For women, through the vagina. The pyramid didn't stab, it split. It didn't need to be sharp, it only needed time. As hours passed, the tearing began. Skin gave way, then muscle, then tissue. No major arteries hit, at least not at first, because the torturers were careful, trained even. They knew how to position a body, how to angle the descent, so the spike would enter, but not kill. And that's what made this pure psychological warfare. You weren't just being tortured, you were being preserved in pain. Some victims sat on the cradle for 12 hours, others 3 days, no food, no sleep, no movement, just the constant sensation of being split open, millimetre by millimetre. They couldn't shift their weight, they couldn't scream for long. Eventually even the voice gave out, only shaking, convulsing, silent suffering. Bodily functions gave out first. They would urinate, defecate, vomit, all while still suspended and still alive. And all of it, every moment, was by design. This wasn't meant to punish a crime. It was meant to destroy a person, slowly. And just when you think it couldn't get worse, wait until you hear how they kept the victims alive, just so the suffering would never stop. You'd think the goal was to kill, but no, death was far too merciful. The real goal was to keep them alive. The torturers didn't just inflict pain, they managed it. Like twisted surgeons, they monitored the suffering, just enough to break the body, but never let it fully collapse. And the techniques they used, disturbingly methodical. They knew that if the pyramid pierced too deep, too fast, the victim could bleed out. So they adjusted the descent, minute by minute, hour by hour, always calculating how much damage the body could take without shutting down completely. They'd pause the process, let the skin stretch, let the wound swell, then lower again. But the real horror, they treated the wounds just enough to prevent death. Salt water was poured onto the entry point, not to soothe, but to sterilize. It burned badly, but it reduced the chance of infection, at least in the beginning. Sometimes they'd even swab the wound clean, not out of mercy, but because pus slowed the suffering. They wanted every nerve ending raw, exposed, alive. If the victim passed out from the pain, which happened often, they'd throw cold water on them, slap them awake, force them to return to the agony. They didn't want unconscious bodies. They wanted reactions, tears, screams, trembling muscles. And for those who survived more than a day, they weren't left to starve. They were fed, sloppily, by hand, sometimes with broth, sometimes with water, not for nourishment, but to keep organs working just long enough to finish the torture. They wanted the victim's body functional, but barely. And even as the wound worsened, as feces and urine mixed with open flesh, they still kept the victim alive. But here's where it turns, because no matter how clean they tried to keep it, no matter how much salt water or attention they gave, eventually the body fought back, not to escape, but to shut down. Septic shock set in. Infection spread through the bloodstream. Organs began to fail. Delirium kicked in. Some victims started hallucinating, screaming at invisible figures, begging for death from people who weren't there. And yet, some still lived for days. The Judas cradle didn't need blades. It didn't need heat or fire, just patience, and a horrifying understanding of the human body. But even death wasn't always a mercy, because the real purpose of this torture wasn't just to hurt, it was to humiliate. This didn't happen in some hidden dungeon. No, the Judas cradle was often rolled out into the town square, right in the heart of the city, where the markets bustled, the churches loomed, and the people gathered. Because this wasn't just torture, it was theatre. Crowds would form early, jostling for a clear view. Mothers brought their children. Vendors sold bread while someone was being slowly impaled, right there in front of them. The victim, naked, filthy, screaming, tied up, suspended, and already bleeding. And the people watched, some with horror, but others, they laughed, they clapped, they pointed. It was a show, a lesson, a warning. Priests would stand nearby, sometimes even leading prayers over the broken body, claiming that God was present in the punishment. If the victim lost control of their bowels, which most did, they defecated in front of the crowd. They urinated while groaning, eyes rolled back in pain, and the crowd didn't look away. They leaned in closer, because in this twisted world, pain wasn't private. It was entertainment, righteous, justified, divine. Sometimes children were placed up front, so they'd learn early what happens when you question authority, what happens when you stray from the church, and if the crowd wasn't entertained, if the screams weren't loud enough, if the bleeding wasn't dramatic enough, they'd make it worse. They'd increase the descent, add weights, or restart the torture from the beginning. The Judas cradle wasn't just designed to destroy the body, it was built to destroy dignity. And when it happened in public, under the sun, surrounded by clapping hands and smiling faces, it didn't just break the victim, it broke all of us. So who ended up on the Judas cradle? Was it murderers, traitors, monsters, number? Most of the time, it was ordinary people. You could be accused of heresy for something as small as a question, a doubt, a disagreement with a priest, or even just silence. Many of the victims were women, not because they committed crimes, but because they didn't obey. A midwife who knew too much about childbirth, a healer with herbal remedies, a woman who refused to marry the man her father chose. Witch, heretic, devil's bride. That's all it took. You could be condemned for knowing too much, or for speaking too little, for being too powerful, or just too inconvenient. Even political enemies, rivals of church officials or landowners could find themselves accused overnight. No trial, no appeal, just a whisper, and then the ropes. There are documented cases of wives being tortured for disrespect. Not infidelity, not betrayal, just disrespect. A look, a tone, a refusal to kneel, and once the accusation was made, there was no turning back, because the Judas cradle wasn't about justice. It was about control, punishment for disobedience, a warning to everyone else. Stay quiet, stay small, stay in line. But perhaps the most disturbing part is how eerily similar this still feels. It's easy to picture the torturer as some deranged villain, a sadist, born cruel, but that's not always how it started. Many of them were trained, appointed by religious or political authorities, given instruction, tools, and, most dangerously, permission. At first some were hesitant, shaking hands, sleepless nights, but over time, that changed. Because pain, repeated enough times, becomes routine, and when you're told it's for a holy purpose, you stop seeing a person and start seeing a problem to solve. Journals from the era reveal something chilling, not just obedience, but pride. One torturer described how he could keep a victim alive for 3 full days on the Judas cradle, with 0 infection. He wrote about it like a chef perfecting a recipe. Another bragged about how quickly he could make someone confess. Within 4 screams, he noted, as if that was a skill, as if he deserved applause. There was a strange honour among them, a twisted professionalism. They compared techniques, kept records, refined their craft, and that desensitization. It wasn't accidental. It was built into the system. The more detached they became, the more efficient they became, and the more efficient they became, the more suffering they caused. Some did enjoy it, the power, the control, the fact that everyone feared them, even priests, especially priests. But others, perhaps the most terrifying kind, didn't enjoy it at all. They just believed it was right, that they were saving souls, that they were doing God's work. They convinced themselves it was necessary, that their hands were clean, even when they were soaked in blood. And now, after all this, you're probably wondering, how did this ever stop? Eventually. The Judas cradle faded from public view. By the late 1600s, more modern torture methods took its place. The rack, the pair of anguish, the Iron Maiden. Cruelty didn't end, it just evolved. And as the Enlightenment began to rise, as science and reason started challenging blind faith, devices like the cradle were quietly buried, literally and historically. But that doesn't mean it disappeared entirely. Rogue inquisitors in remote regions were said to still use it. Even into the 1700s, it wasn't written about as much. But whispers persisted. A few journals mention the pyramid method. One account from 1763 describes a woman found dead in a village square, her body impaled, her wounds almost identical to Judas cradle victims from 2 centuries earlier. And in the shadows of war and political unrest, some believe similar techniques never really left. There are rumours, from Cold War prisons, black ops sites, and regimes that thrive on fear, of methods eerily like the Judas cradle. Crude, yes, but effective. Because the logic behind it doesn't require advanced tools, just cruelty and patience And that's what makes it so terrifying. It didn't die. It hid, buried in basements, whispered in dark corridors, replicated without a name. But before we move on, let's look at one case you won't believe actually happened. Her name was Maria de Leone. She was 22, a midwife, a healer, a daughter, and in 1647 she was accused of heresy for owning a book filled with herbal remedies and notes written in Latin. That's all it took. She was dragged from her home in the middle of the night. No trial, no defense, just a declaration. She consorts with the devil. And so, in the town square of Bracciano, they prepared the Judas cradle. Eyewitness accounts describe the morning clearly. Maria, naked, shivering, bound, was hoisted above the pyramid by her wrists. A priest read scripture as the pulley creaked. Her first scream came within seconds. It echoed through the streets, windows shut, mothers covered their children's ears. But no one stopped it. The descent was slow. That first day they lowered her only a few inches, just enough to tear the skin, to open the body, to let pain settle in like rot. She passed out twice. They revived her both times, not out of mercy, but because the show wasn't over. On the second day, her body began to swell. Internal bruising, muscle tearing. She could no longer speak, just moan. Her mother, they say, tried to intervene. She was dragged away. The third day was the worst. The wounds had become septic. Flies swarmed the base of the pyramid. Maria was delirious, screaming nonsense, eyes wide with terror. Some in the crowd cried, others laughed. The priest kept praying. At hour 64, she stopped moving. The torturer called for a final descent, a full inch. It split her pelvis. She died instantly. And when her body was finally taken down, what they found shocked even the inquisitors. Her abdomen was bloated with infection, her inner thighs shredded, bone fragments had splintered under pressure. One journal entry read, "She was opened like a flower, and yet still she breathed." That line haunted the town for generations. Some said they heard her screams in the chapel walls for years after. Maria de Leone didn't just die on the Judas cradle, she was sacrificed on it. Not because she was guilty, not because she was dangerous, but because she knew too much and lived in a world where knowledge was a crime. We like to think we've moved on, that we've evolved past this kind of barbarism. But have we? Because some modern interrogation techniques aren't all that different. Stress positions, sleep deprivation, sensory overload, all designed to break a person's mind without leaving visible scars. In CIA black sites, detainees have been held in positions eerily similar to the Judas cradle, forced to sit or squat for hours, even days, joints collapsing, muscles tearing. Sound familiar? They call it enhanced interrogation. But let's be honest, that's just a cleaner word for torture. And just like in the Middle Ages, it's often justified, sanctioned, wrapped in the language of safety, truth, and greater good. Back then, it was to save souls. Today, it's to protect nations. The reasons change, the cruelty doesn't. So yes, the Judas cradle is gone, but its spirit, it lingers, in prisons, in war zones, in silence. And now that you know, what will you do with this knowledge? You made it. You survived the Judas cradle, at least in thought. But imagine if you hadn't just watched this. Imagine if you had lived it. The ropes cutting into your skin, the slow descent, the pyramid splitting you open, infection setting in, crowds cheering, and no one coming to help. We've walked through humiliation, torture, and death. We've seen how knowledge became a crime, and pain became policy, not as some forgotten horror, but as a reminder, a warning. Because history doesn't just live in books, It breathes in silence, in systems, in shadows. This device was built to destroy the human soul. But what's more terrifying is how many people watched it happen and did nothing. And that's why we tell these stories. Not to shock for the sake of shock, but to remember, to learn, to make sure cruelty wrapped in righteousness never walks freely again. If this shocked you, and you know someone who'd be horrified, share it, and subscribe for even darker truths history tried to bury. Because this was only one chapter.